This conference will now be recorded.
Sean, as always, it's a real pleasure to talk to you, and I'm super excited to have you on the podcast.
Glad to be here, Brett. Excited that I could come aboard and chat with you today.
For sure. So, obviously some people in soccer and hockey, have a pretty good idea who you are, but, if you want to give the rest of the audience a background and a journey to your current role with the Avalanche.
Yeah, usually when I tell the story to my inside sales team, it takes 20 minutes for me because I don't shut up about every place I've ever been to. So I'll try and spare you of that. But I started my career coming out of Penn State, did an internship with the Steelers, learned from there that if I wanted to get back with the Steelers, I was going to either need to get into sales or marry a Rooney. And I know I'm not going to marry a Rooney. So got into enterprise rent-a-car, learned how to sell there, moved to minor league baseball, cut my teeth in group sales, spent 3 years there. Left there as the director of marketing, which nobody should be the director of marketing at the age of 24. I learned that quick. And the entire time, like, I was just trying to get into marketing. And when I hit the wall there where I was in it, I realized I didn't know much about what I was doing, and I kind of got lost. A few years after that, I left the industry. I worked for a brand new museum in DC called the National Museum of Crime and Punishment. I sold printing. I was really kind of lost trying to find my way as to what I was going to do with my life at that point. And once I got into printing, I realized if I'm going to sell something, I need to get back into sports because that's where my passion was. That's where it lie. So I met a girl around that same time. She decided she was moving to Phoenix, Arizona. She got into a PA program out there, and I'm not sure if she invited me or if I just assumed that the sale and went along with her. But I started making a couple calls and got a job with the Coyotes. Started again as an account executive after having been in a few management roles, but I realized that if I was going to do this and get back into sports, I had to do it right and to kind of work my way back up the ladder. That proved to be a pretty interesting time for the Coyotes. About 2 months after I started, they declared a bankruptcy, and there's a pretty good case study coming down the road on selling the Coyotes probably in a few years. But I learned how to sell in an environment where we were league owned, and we didn't know where we were going to be in the coming years. But during that time, it afforded me a lot of opportunities to gain experience. I was the manager of group sales, the director of new business. When I left, we didn't have a VP, and I was essentially the person leading the charge on all ticket sales initiatives. But there was something that was kind of bugging me at the time. I felt like I had a really big blind spot or weakness. Don't tell Bryant Pfeiffer. Hopefully he's not listening to this podcast. But at the time, I felt like I had this weakness in sales training and in culture in particular, and I really wanted to enhance that skill set before I took on a bigger role and hopefully sat in the VP chair. And so I applied to work for Major League Soccer's National Sales Center and was blessed to take on that opportunity, take over for a pretty great sales trainer who was leaving at the time. But during that window, I learned how to sell. I learned how to teach a sales process. I learned that culture is intentional, and really kind of took one of my weaknesses and made it probably my biggest strength to this day. And at this point, like that's kind of where I felt comfortable taking on a bigger role and sitting in the chair for VP, and I took on that opportunity with the Colorado Rapids. I was there for 2 years and eventually moved over to the Avalanche, where I'm at today.
Yeah, and you've got a tremendous career with a lot of real perspective, a lot of opportunities, sitting in a lot of seats. But I think one of the things that outside of the sales center, one of the things that you and I share is having been outside of the industry and inside of the industry, and a lot of times for a young rep who may be struggling or trying to find their way in sales, the grass can look greener, right? Like there can be more money to make outside of sports. There can be more work-life balance outside of sports. Can you talk about what are the differences, especially as it relates to being in sales, being inside of sports as opposed to being outside of sports? Because I think, both you and I, having been out there, I don't necessarily think either one of us would want to go back out there for any real reason, because of sports. So can you talk a little bit about the grass may look greener, but why sports is just a cooler place to be?
For sure. I mean, and I think that's a personal preference, but it's obviously a
Yeah.
personal preference for both of us and a lot of the people we work with. I remember working in minor leagues, and I was making 15 grand a year. Like, I actually broke it down one time, and I'd never encourage somebody to do this, but for the amount of hours that I was working, I was making like $2 an hour. Um, and so, like, it really calls into question, like, okay, like, I love sports. This is what I'm passionate about. But can I survive on this? And is there a future to that? And I remember at one point, I think I kind of achieved that marketing position, and that's what I really, really wanted. And it didn't feel like I had won once I'd gotten into that role. And I remember feeling very frustrated, like, how am I going to, what's my next step? Where do I go with this? And so I left, and I probably had a moment of self-righteousness, and I'm going to go chase some money and buy some season tickets. And for some people, that probably is the right decision. But for me, like, when I got out there, I realized that, and this is something that's been told to me everywhere I've gone, like, you're not going to be a good salesperson if you're not passionate about the product that you're selling.
Yeah.
Now, I chased a paycheck, with especially that printing museum, like that. I was like, oh my god, I can be stable. I can go out and buy drinks, at the bar, and cover a bar tab, which I couldn't do when I was in minor league. And I was like, all those things are going to make me happy, but I wasn't successful in sales there because I wasn't passionate about the product. And I kind of hit this wall at the time where I was like, oh my god, like, am I ever going to be good at sales again? And I'm sure everybody's had that moment in their career where they're riding high and then riding really low. But for me, it was like, okay, what's important to me? And that's when it kind of called back to me. Is like, I need to get back into sports because that's where I was proud to say what I did. That's what I got excited to get up and do in the morning. And even though at the time the money wasn't there, um, I found that when I got to the Coyotes and really put my passion in front of me, like, that led me to be a much better salesperson, and I actually wound up making a lot more money in that position.
Yeah, and I think that's a question you have to ask for yourself is, if you're getting into sports, don't, I mean, this sounds horrible, but like, don't do it to make money right away. If you want to make money, to your point, there's a ton of avenues and a ton of ways to be able to do it. I think, no matter what job we have in sports, although it's like a team precedent, we're always making less money than we do on the other side, but, it's easily justifiable by the opportunities and the experiences and the fact that we really do get to wake up and do something that we're incredibly passionate about, every single day, which is really cool. And I think that was
For
a
sure.
really good point by you. So, you've had a pretty intriguing career, as we talked about, and my guess is I could probably guess some of the mentors that you say along the way. But I always think it's important that we take a step back and think about who are those people that have really been important to us in our career and our growth and development. And not only that, but what was it about those individuals that we wanted to emulate, or we wanted to make sure that we were taking what they taught us to teach other people? So who are some of those people for you?
I've been blessed to have had quite a few people in my life, and almost with every single one of them, I've learned something unique and different. And that's actually part of the value I've gotten in having all the positions that I've had, is I've gotten to learn from a lot of different people. It's helped craft who I am in some cases, and in some cases who I don't want to be. Some of the big names that have kind of influenced me along the way, my current boss, he's the chief ticketing officer and SVP here at Cronky, David Burke. Burke is as much a friend as he is a boss. Like, I was in his wedding, he's in mine. He's the godfather to my kids. So when I come to work every day, we have a relationship where we trust each other. We know we prioritize each other's goals, and we go to bat for each other every single day. I think the thing that I've learned from him the most out of everybody I've ever worked for is he's a very strong visionary, and when he has an idea or he has a vision for where he wants the business to go to be, or where he wants the business to go, he sells that vision both up and down. And I've never seen anybody in my career that's been as strong at doing that. And it's really helped to kind of change the path of ticket sales here with the Avalanche, and drive us in a very positive direction. I've worked with Tom Garrity, who is the owner of Quant Sports and Consulting. He's taught me that the value of a personal connection with my sales staff is probably one of the strongest motivators that I can employ. And I still remember days where I'd be sitting in a room like going through numbers with him at the Coyotes, and he would just stop me mid sentence and ask a sales rep to come in and just ask him how his family was, ask him how his weekend was. And you just see a connection and a relationship built between Tom and some of the sales reps, and that's something that I got to watch, and I try to employ as much as I possibly can. Brian Pfeiffer, common connection between you and I. Brian Pfeiffer, I said it earlier, taught me that sales culture is intentional. Probably one of the most cliche things, and I refuse to say it, and my day to day is we work hard and we play hard. I think every single person, not just in the sports industry, but in sales in general, has that line somewhere in their repertoire. But what I find is that there aren't a lot of people out there that have a specific plan for what they want their sales culture to be and how they're going to get themselves to that. And Brian taught me how to build a plan around that and to execute against it, and I can't thank him enough for all the lessons I've learned there. He's also somebody, I wouldn't say he taught me a sales process, but he embedded one into me in a way that I to this day try to make sure that our sales staff feels that same way, and at no time should they be confused about what are the steps of the sales process and where they're at in that process in and of itself. And then finally, like my first boss, Addie Stabler, with the Bowie Bay Sox, she taught me what I'm capable of. I mean, there were days where I would put up 120 phone calls, and she would tell me that wasn't good enough. And I think we would all agree that there's times where 120 calls helps you, and sometimes it can be counterproductive. But she taught me that I could do that, and and doing that and kind of pushing me. She almost was like a coach at a gym, where she would just ask me to do one more rep, and you really don't know what you're capable of unless sometimes you have somebody pushing you to find those boundaries and barriers for yourself. And in a lot of ways that helped craft me to be the salesperson and leader that I am today.
Yeah, so there's especially those last two things I want to talk about. So in terms of pushing yourself a little bit, can you talk a little bit about the importance of obviously it's easy to think about why it's important for a vice president or a manager to help push each other, but putting yourself back in your sales rep shoes, I remember all the way back to CEB when I was having to make 200 phone calls a day. There's a guy named Steve Alexander, and Steve and I would just push each other every single day. Can you talk about the importance of a sales rep finding that person internally to push themselves, to push them further, whether that person's a manager or a fellow rep? What's the overall value of having that person? Because doing more work isn't the sexiest thing on the planet.
Yeah, no, I think having that person in your life is pivotal. I mean, there are times where you find yourself at the top of the sales board and you're all alone and you don't have that internal benchmark to push against or somebody to push you higher. And I think you need to find it from a bunch of different places. For me, when I was a sales rep, there's a gentleman named Ian Winkleman. I believe he's with Globetrotters right now, but we used to sit in the office and we would set a goal for ourselves, and we were competitive people. We were like, who's going to be the first person to leave? Who's the first person to close a sale today? Who's the first person to hit 100 phone calls? And I think those things, if you don't have goals, you constantly are looking to find, to find purpose. And when you don't have that, you miss out on opportunities. I think that's both important short term and long term. But in particular to where you were going with on the phone is like, I think there's times where I have young sales reps come up to me and say, God, I could do what I'm doing and do it in 60 phone calls. And, the reality here is maybe you could, but if you do 60 and you leave 40 calls out at the end of the day, like there could have been a sale in there that you don't know you could have had. And I think it's our job, especially early on, while you're still trying to find your style and your boundaries and how you sell, to challenge you to work more and work harder and see what you possibly can do. Because at some point, there's not going to be somebody sitting over your shoulder, and you got to know that side of yourself.
And that's probably why it's invaluable sometimes that person is another sales rep, right? Because, you got to stare at that person all day, whereas, the vice president, the manager, the director can always walk into their office, and, when they're not directly in front of you, you can create that excuse to not do that work. But, it's a lot harder. I mean, you talk about Ian, I talk about Steve. It's a lot harder when that person's staring at you for most of that day.
For sure.
And you're finding that person who's going to keep pushing you beyond when, there's that quote, it's like, what is it, the people who perform the best are the people that work the hardest when no one's watching, or whatever that quote is. I'm sure I just butchered it, but when the managers aren't watching and the directors aren't watching, do you have someone that's holding you accountable is really critical for young salespeople to find.
And I think the other thing too is having somebody that's going through the exact same things you are is what's really important. I think, I remember there was a time where, I would pump out 150, 200 calls a day. My sales staff doesn't see that out of me, the way that they would have if they had been sitting in a desk next to me 15 years ago, and that's not their fault in any way, shape, or form. But I would say that, when I'm sitting in my office and I walk out and I say make 150 phone calls, I can understand from a rep's perspective how that could seem disingenuous, or that I don't understand the position that they're in. And I completely empathize with that viewpoint. But when you have somebody that's sitting next to you that is going through the exact same challenges and hearing the same objections and selling the same product, that really helps you benchmark against something common and helps to push you to places that you may not know that you could go.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other one I want to talk about real quick, because I think it's important. It's easier for us to listen to us, who obviously have had director or vice president experience, and us talk about culture being intentional. But there's going to be a lot of reps who listen to this that maybe in a culture or environment that they don't like or may not be a positive one. So what are some of the things that you would tell a rep to do, or what advice would you give a sales rep if they found themselves in a really difficult cultural situation? I mean, the easiest one's to get out of it, find a better culture, but what are some small things a rep can do to help them either improve the culture of the people around them, or to isolate and make sure that they remain focused on doing their job themselves and not get caught up in the other stuff that's happening?
I think a lot of it is asking yourself and maybe your peers around you of, what's important, like what motivates you guys individually. Like take on the same challenge that we face as managers when we're sitting there trying to craft a culture, which is how important is career growth, how important is making more money, how important is training, how important is energy on the floor, like all of the things that we have 11 different staples that we've got as part of our sales culture business plan, and we have a kind of a champion internally that helps drive each of those core pillars. That's just the system we've created, but it's a system that a rep could create for themselves. So if you know that coming to work and having fun is something that makes a strong sales culture, that's something a rep can control on their own. I find that actually some of the best strategies and culture actually come from the sales staff themselves. Just the other day I walked out and I don't know what was happening, but one of my reps singing the national anthem. I don't know why, but the entire staff was pumped and they were backing them and they were excited about it. So something was happening there organically that I didn't actually put a plan behind, but the reps took on themselves and did something to help make the workday a little bit more light. And I think that's something that I actually think that a lot of ways, sales representatives have more power over the culture than sometimes even the leaders do, because there are a lot of ways the people that execute and have to buy in. So I think the leader, I shouldn't say that. The leader is a very, very, very important part of that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be in all cases, as if you are willing to step in and fill the void in that leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it boils down to something as simple as, I mean, you can either complain about it, or you can take action to make it better. And I think the people that we see ultimately succeed, regardless of the situation they're in, are always those people that are the ones that either take action to support it or take action that they believe is correct in terms of going ahead and fixing it.
And one other point to add to this is, like, when we're looking for future leaders in management, the people that are doing that instinctually on their own and helping to add to culture and to build a culture on their own, and we kind of view that, it's no shocker that those usually are the people that kind of make their way towards the top of the group when it comes time to promote a manager. Because at the end of the day, like, when we have a management spot open, revenue is a really important part, and like your ability to drive revenue is a really important part of that discussion. But it's not always the top salesperson that's going to get promoted, and at least it is in this organization. Like, the people that are strong leaders and the staff are going to respond to, you may be number 2 on the board or number 3 on the board, and you've built this background of success there, but you're not number 1. But you might be a stronger leader than the person who's at number 1, and we oftentimes will gravitate in that direction. So just go out on a day-to-day basis and try and be that example. And I've found in my career, and you look at all the places I've been, that's helped me. My interview most of the time was while I was on the sales floor, not while I was sitting across the desk, with my resume.
Absolutely, there's no doubt about that. So I'm sure here's the reason why everyone paid the big bucks to listen to the two of us talk is the National Sales Center, something that you and I shared in common. And I think it's easy to take a look back and see that there was a lot of reps who came to the program that we didn't think were going to be very good, and ultimately they get to the team and they become successful. And then there's a lot of reps who we thought would be, these guys are going to be terrific, we're giving you an all-star, and ultimately they didn't make it. So thinking about both those cases where someone succeeded where we didn't think they were going to succeed, or someone didn't succeed that we thought were going to be successful, why were we so off in those things? Because I know that you've got people that immediately come to mind for both of those, and I know that I've got immediately have people that come to mind in both.
And I know somewhere out there, Jeff Berryhill's flipping this on, who's a former peer of ours at the sales center, and listening and laughing along with us here. Yeah, there are times where I was like, I would have bet every cent in my 401k on a rep, and they were out of the business within a year. And there's other ones that took longer to come along, but are leading sales teams right now. I think there were times where I, as a trainer at the sales center, put so much, and I kind of overvalued my impact on the longevity of a career. I think that, part of my role was to get somebody in the door and help them find success early. Like, I think when sales reps come out of the sales center, or even out of inside sales, if it's not the sales center, a lot of their first goal is just to be good at what they're doing. To be honest with you, like, maybe it's probably to put enough cash in their pocket to pay the rent and buy a couple drinks at the bar, but ultimately it's to be good early on. And at some point, for most people, if we did our jobs right at the sales center, they were successful quickly. And they got a sales process. They felt more confident earlier on, and they executed on it. But that doesn't really speak to, in a lot of ways, the longevity of a career and whether somebody sticks in sports or not. I actually pull a lot more out of my own experience as to why I think reps stick around or they don't. And I think a lot of times in my career when I was a sales rep, I felt lost. Like, I didn't know where I was in relation to my goal, and my goal was to be the head of ticketing and or the head of something, and sometimes I didn't even know what that meant. But like, I think if you're a sales rep and you've been doing this for 2 or 3 years and you're not sure, like, okay, like, do I need to invest another 3 years before I'll get a crack at a management role, or do I need to do I need to leave, or do I need, like, there's a lot of questions. And if a leader doesn't specifically give you a path and what they expect of you along the way in order to see a promotion or to see more money, I think that lost feeling is why a lot of people, kind of flail out of the business. And to be honest with you, that's kind of why I did. Like, for even though I'm sitting in this seat right now, I definitely had that period of time, as I talked about earlier, where I was lost and I left. And I'm no better or different than a lot of the people that have worked for me that probably felt that same kind of lost feeling. And so one of the things we've done here with the Avalanche is to really try and map, kind of benchmarks, year 1, year 2, year 3. Like, inside sales is about, establishing a skill set for sales and to really mastering the 6-step process. And year 1 is about building a book of business. And year 2 is about becoming a consistent performer and starting to challenge the top of the leaderboard. And year 3, I'm looking for them to really start adding leadership skills and to start to, really gravitate towards the top of the group as a leader and to take on, bigger projects. And we even crafted a senior AE program that has very specific deliverables from our side as managers to the reps, where we're trying to give them a peek behind the curtain as to, when you are a manager, here's a budget for a small sales event, go manage it, operate it, and run it, so that when they get to an interview down the road and they're interviewing for a manager position, like, they've got skill sets and some confidence going into that space versus, hey, like, I've been a salesperson and now I'm being asked to do a completely different thing and being a manager. And I think sometimes that's lost. And if you don't have a plan as a manager to bring somebody along that way, you have people that feel lost. It feels like I'm on a soapbox right now when I say that, but, to be honest with you, that was a discovery that I kind of had a few years ago. And it wasn't until recently till we actually set a plan in place. But for any leader out there that it feels like they're losing people to that, like, I would encourage setting kind of that plan in place. And for any rep that's out there that feels lost, it might just be sitting down with your manager and saying, this is where I want to go in my career. Help me map a path. And I think between those two strategies, both as a leader and as a salesperson, finding that purpose will help you kind of hang in the business and help you ensure what you're doing. And when you're making 100 phone calls a day and you're staying up till 11:30, 12 at night with the post-game slap shot, why you're doing all those things is tied to something that's important to you.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point too. And one thing I'd like to add on to it is that it's okay if people's paths are different too, though, right? Like, it's okay
sure.
that if there may be a finish line, but people may just finish it at different times, and that doesn't make someone better or worse for it. I can think about, one of the things I was super proud of when I was at the Crew is we had 2 reps who finished and made all rookie. There were 4 reps in the entire league who made all rookie sales, and 2 of them were for Columbus. And I know, having worked for the Rapids, just how difficult that mark was to hit. And one of them graduated from inside sales at the absolute bare minimum amount of time. We knew the kid was going to be a rock star. And it took the other kid 18 months to graduate. And I think, making sure that everything that you talked about is so critically important, and then making sure that along that way you understand, and each rep needs to understand that their path can be different. The finishing is the most important thing. And I think that's where you and I were so shocked sometimes. It wasn't necessarily how a lot of these guys started the race, because that's all we were at the sales center, right? The starter. But it's, did they have the fortitude to finish it? And, sometimes we weren't surprised by people who had the fortitude to finish it. And a lot of times we were surprised by the people that had the fortitude to finish it, or surprised by the people who didn't have the fortitude to finish it. Yeah.
I think about myself and the people I've worked next to. Like, there are people that are smarter than me, that are better salespeople than me, that I work with along my career. And sometimes I just kind of feel like I was the person that had the patience and had probably a little more clear vision about what I wanted out of my career at the time. And that kind of helped me to get where I'm at today. I think when I didn't have that, that's where I tended to not sell, and that's where I tended to be really frustrated and stressed with my situation.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And so I want to turn the page a little bit to, you've had a hand in selling hockey, soccer, minor league baseballs, museums, rental car services. And, thinking back to the time at the sales center, and some of the advantages that we may have given the reps, ultimately, what are some of the sales truths that you've seen across all of those things, everything that you've sold, everything that you've managed in the sales center? What are some of those ultimate sales truths that cross every single boundary?
I think there's one really big one that sticks out, and I think you could have added just about any other product to the mix here, Brett. It's sell value and understand value. I worked in minor league baseball where nobody knew the names of the players or could care less if we were in playoff contention. And most of the time when they walked to the building, they didn't even know if we were in playoff contention. You have to be willing to sit down and understand why they bought that ticket and what they're getting out of it, and be prepared to reflect that back to them in a way that they relate to. I don't think a lot of people always understand or know at kind of the surface level of their conscious, like, why they bought a ticket. And I think sometimes our job as salespeople is not to be somebody who talks you into something, but helps you to find, your real reason or your real value. And, while that existed in minor league baseball, I've sold, some teams that were in tough positions. Like Coyotes, when I was there, they were making the playoffs, which is great. But every single year, at the end of that season, the minute that the last second ticked off, we were back in a position where we didn't know if the team was going to be in Phoenix at the end of the year. And
Yep.
so, going from minor league baseball to there, like, it's a very similar thing in that, like, I had to sell something other than the wins on the ice and the product on the ice, because you can't control that. I've sold teams that weren't in the playoffs, and in some cases I've sold, in fact, in more than a couple cases, I've sold the team that was, worst in the league. And if you build your entire business strategy on wins and losses, I think eventually that'll catch up to you. Sometimes you can get away with it for a year or two if you're coming off a team that's had a long sustained, history of being in the playoffs, and the demand is pent up to a certain way, but it's pent up. But I think, at the end of the day, your ability to connect with fans on a one-on-one basis and understand why specifically it was of value to them, and to find something other than wins and losses. I think that's the right business model for the future, and for you to retain your people and your customers at a high level.
So you're 100% right. I think whatever you're doing, and I think, our good friend Lance Tyson always says, and especially in his new book, you're selling the product of your product, right? And I think that you're both spot on when you say that. Value's a vague word, though. And so when you think about customers, what is the value to the customer if it's not winning? Because I think that's where reps have a really tough time. They get told they have to sell value, and they're like, well, the team sucks, so there's no value there. So define it in a way that a rep who's even selling for a team that's not performing can say, I got it.
I think that the salesperson's role needs to be, when they go into the conversation, it's my job to put my product aside, and we've heard that a lot, but to get the customer to sell me, the salesperson, on why buying a season ticket or a group ticket, or even just coming out one time to a single game, why that can benefit them or help their life in some way. And I stay very broad with that, because you need to be like, when I'm talking to a company and we're talking about, hey, bring out clients, potential clients, to help try and close them on future business. Well, even in that statement, there are different ways that company A will look at that same statement from company B. It might be the deal size is bigger. It might be, that, they're looking to establish a longer term relationship. Like there's so many little nuances to a value statement, and that's why it is a bit vague, but you got to know what you're looking for. And it's just that, like, I like to tell my sales staff, like, if you aren't convinced that this product makes sense for them, don't make a recommendation. Like, it's okay to go into a conversation knowing that you might not pitch the product. And I think a lot of times we as sales trainers and leaders, we embed like, hey, you got to be closing on every call and on every single call. And like, we've really gone to a place where we've redefined what a sale looks like, where it doesn't have to be a sale. It could be a referral. It could be setting an appointment to come down and visit. It could be, setting a specific next step. But I'm not walking in and I'm trying to close on every single call. I'm putting myself before the customer. And I don't know that I necessarily help to crystallize your point there and make it less vague, but I always challenge the staff is like, if you don't know and you aren't sold from them on why this product makes sense for them, then you don't really know the value. You're just kind of skating past that and trying to get to your product pitch, which is usually a losing, it's a recipe for a losing sales call.
Yeah, and it's such an important point because, we don't sell a product where we have to be transactional in nature when we do it. Like, we're better off when we're not. And so how do we make sure that we replicate what it's like to be a fan inside that sales process? And a lot of what that is taking a step back and looking at it through the eye of the buyer, right? And saying, if I was on the other end of the phone and I was getting pitched season tickets, what would I want to hear in that situation? What would help me? How would that person be treating me? What would I be thinking about that? And I'm a big believer that, as a sales rep, it's our job to make a recommendation, but to be able to make a recommendation, right, you need to know enough information about that person to really be able to recommend a product that's going to be the right product for that person, because ultimately it's just going to be like that experience when you go to the restaurant, right, where you go to the server, you're like, what would you recommend? And the server's like, the most expensive thing on the menu, and you're like, well, go screw yourself. If that's the environment you're creating. Whereas if the environment you're creating is like, I need to get to know this person before I make that recommendation, that's going to go so much farther than scrambling through the 6-step sales process just to be able to tell them that they need to buy our most expensive season tickets.
Yep, exactly.
So turning the page a little bit, through our site, we're trying to promote not just, learning sales, but how do you create a positive work-life balance in professional sports, which, as we talked about at the beginning, sometimes you're overworked and sometimes you're underpaid. When you see a rep struggling with work-life balance, or you have a rep tell you that they're struggling with work-life balance, what advice do you give them to help them create a more positive work-life balance?
I always think you need to figure out and carve out time for yourself and for what's important to you outside of work. Otherwise, you're going to be miserable and you're going to flail out of this job and probably future jobs. A couple things that I think are important is, number one is like, sit down and crystallize your goals. Do it on a daily basis, figure it out on a yearly basis in sports, like I think season to season, and think about it on a long-term basis. Like, I think I remember a time where I was working for the museum and we were brand new and we were trying to figure out what our boss's expectations were of us. And we kind of went through the day and we achieved everything we set out to, but nobody wanted to be the first person to get up and walk out the door. So we used to just sit at our desks, and it was kind of like a game of chicken, like who was gonna get up and do it first. And I look back and think how stupid that was. But, a lesson that I've learned a long time, or over the years since that time, is like, probably I didn't do that instinctually because I didn't know what what expectations were of me, and feel good enough that if I walked out the door, I could say whether I achieved them or not. And for some people, like, looking at it, their bots have very specific expectations, and it's really easy to kind of know whether you've ticked those boxes off or not. And for some, maybe you don't. And so you got to sit down and define that with your boss and with yourself. And when you've achieved them, go home. Like don't sit there and feel like, you've got to sit here and spend 3 extra hours just because. Like, you have to find time in your life to, go out and do the things that are important to you outside of work. As passionate as I am about sports, I would get
Yeah.
sick of sports real quick if that's everything and the only thing that I did. And it's a real quick and easy way to turn yourself off to something that probably several years ago when you weren't selling, you were extremely passionate about. I think the other thing too is, like, I always set like future benchmarks and things that, I'm going to do no matter what happens to me, whether I get the big sale, whether I hit my sales goal, whether I don't. Like, I don't tie this specific thing that's going to make me happy to a specific goal, but it's going to happen. And I kind of look forward, and I always have that thing in my head. Like, it used to be when I was a sales rep, like, I loved the NFL draft. Like, I was a
Yep.
nerd. I would sit down and like that day to me, especially being in hockey with it coming up, like, that was kind of towards the end of the regular season. It was a day, like, no matter what, I was going to take the day off. I was going to order in pizza, get myself a case of beer, invite my friends over, and I would just sit there all day and be a nerd. And like,
Yep.
knowing that day was going to happen, whether I hit my sales goal or not, whether I, knocked this project out of the park or not, knowing that was in my future and it was going to happen, it's something to kind of look forward to along the way when things are tough. And so I think it's important to have those moments, because if you're not looking forward to something, or if there's nothing in your future and you're just caught up in the stress of, am I going to hit my number or not? That can be pretty scary. And it's another reason, talking earlier about why people don't stick around. Like, I think it's another reason why people leave the business.
Yeah, and two quick things to add to it, and I'll certainly let you comment on it. But first of all, write those goals down, right? I think that's the most
Oh, for
important
sure.
thing. If those, and let them stare you in the face. Like, don't write it in a notebook, close the notebook, and put it aside. I tell the story when I talk about this, but when I was at the sales center, I was working basically 24 hours a day to get that thing up and off the ground. And I went from, about 160 pounds to about 200 pounds, especially eating at Schwan Foods too, pretty quick. And I knew I had my best friend's wedding coming up, and I'm a solid mid 160s right now. And I'm still pretty chubby. And so you can only imagine what I look like at 200 pounds. I look like a Charlie Brown character. But, every single day I wrote down the goal of where I wanted to get to and where I was at. And, even though progress is a little bit slow sometimes, being able to benchmark myself against that and drive myself to that is really important. So, making sure it's not just, it's easy to say write it down, but make sure that those goals are staring at you, whether they're 10 years down the line or, 10 minutes down the line are critical. And then, the second thing that I thought the point you made is, listen, if you worked from 9 to 5 and you got the job done, go. Like, just get out of the office, go. Like, you did your job. Some days, you just can't focus, or maybe you had a few too many drinks and you spent the first hour of the day just shaking it off and get stuff done. Those things happen in a workplace. But if those are days where you got to be like, I got to go till 6 then, or I got to come in early the next day, do whatever it takes to get the job done, which goes back to having a goal for each day. What do I need to accomplish today? Where do I need to be at the end of the day? Write that down, and if you do it between 9 and 5, get out of here. And if you don't, all right, I may have to stay late. I may have to come in early, but just make sure that those are the things you're focused on.
I think that's a really important point, Brett, because I think sometimes, like, just telling myself when I should stay late and have I achieved the goal I set to achieve, like, it helps to qualify how much more work I need to put in if I'm going to stay late. We all know that this isn't, and we've been told this isn't a 9 to 5 job, and that's true, but it's only not 9 to 5 because your job is not defined on the amount of hours that you work, but the results that you provide. And if you do that in 6 hours, feel good about leaving at 5. If it takes you, if it takes 2 extra hours to get it done, then you at least feel good, like that what you've done and what you need to do to achieve that. And like I think that's a really important point. I think also too, setting the goals helps to tell you what not to do. Like, it helps you during the day, like when somebody asks you to do this busy work, or somebody asks you to go on a walk, and you're sitting here like, I'd like to leave at 5. Like, it helps you to qualify and say like, okay, like if I do this, then I might sacrifice this. And if you're making those decisions, like it helps you drastically take the weight off of yourself. It's like, I always look at it, it's like, would I walk into the gym and not know what my goals are for the gym that day? Like, I would probably want to know what I did last week and how to improve upon it and what my plan is, because every time I've walked into the gym and I didn't have a plan, like I do 10 reps and I walk out and probably go pound some chocolate or something like that and feel bad about myself. So, like it's no different than what you do in your personal life.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we'll wrap this up on the question I wrap up each one of these podcasts. I think it's important for the people that are listening. What ultimately drives you?
There's two things. The beginning part of my career, I'll be 100% blunt. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Like, the things that drove me were really they were really self-driven. Like, I wanted to make a certain amount of money, or I wanted to get to a certain position in my career. And like, everything I did wasn't like me asking my boss to do those things for me, but it was what I asked of myself and how I had to push myself during the day to stand out and to be eligible for those things. And so I probably spent the first 10 years of my career really focused on myself and trying to get to a certain job in a certain place. And once I kind of hit my goal, like I'd always said, like I want to be, like, once I kind of reassessed my career, I said I want to be the VP of ticket sales. And then I achieved that, and I was like, oh crap, like what do I do now? Like, where do I go from here? And like, I'm at a place right now where what drives me is being great at the job that I'm doing. And I've defined that as like, I want to be sold out every single game for the Avalanche. And if we win a cup next year, I'll look like a genius, and that'll be a heck of a lot easier. But I can't rely on that, and I can't build my business plan around that. So I'm constantly challenging myself and my staff to lay the foundation of the plan in place to get us there, regardless of team performance. And that's kind of what gets me up for the day. Is like, I love sports, but I'm an even bigger nerd as it relates to selling tickets and
Yep.
and this job in and of itself. And that's coming in and doing that and trying to get to that goal where I can say like, yep, we weren't sold out and now we are. That's kind of the narrow focus and like my goal of where I want to go personally. But I'd say there's another big thing too, is like, I think long term, how I'm gonna evaluate my career over like when I hang it up and I'm no longer selling tickets and no longer in this business, like, how will I define success? And I can already tell you, like, being 10 years into kind of the management side and almost 15 years in the business altogether, like, I've already forgotten some of the big milestones that we hit whenever I was with other teams. And, when we hit goal, like, those things start to blend together. But I really think over the course of my career, the way I'll evaluate myself is more on the people that I've worked with and where they've gone in their career. And
Absolutely.
so I feel like when I leave, if this summer we had 2 managers get promoted to director positions, one in the MLS and one in MLB. Like, when I see those guys VP of ticket sales down the road, and when I see my directors running teams, and some of the reps that I've even if I've from my seat had just a small impact, see them leading the charge in the industry. Like, to me, that's what drives me, is like looking around me and seeing, like, was I able to help other people help them find success? And if I can do that, like, I can promise you, like, I'll look at my career in a much different way, a much more positive way than probably on, did I, hit a 95% retention rate or 99% retention rate, which is what I'm seeing out of some of the teams right now. In terms of season ticket sales.
Yeah, it's your Bill Walsh's coaching tree, right? Like, are those people
Yep.
leaving a positive effect on on the people around it. And I think ultimately, when I think about some of the best managers, I think to your point, it isn't necessarily, what they accomplished while they were where they were. I think it is, how did they treat the people, and how did they extend those people into real, and prepare them to have real careers outside of what they were doing. And as crazy as it sounds, a lot of times if you're able to accomplish the second thing, the first thing kind of takes care of itself along the way.
Yep, for sure.
All right, Sean. Well, listen, as always, it's great to talk to you, and I certainly appreciate everything you're doing out in Colorado, and look forward to being in touch.
Brett, I really appreciate you having me today. Thanks so much.
Yeah, buddy.